Welcome to the Save What You Love podcast. I'm Mark Titus, your host, and today I get to sit down with David Moskowitz. David is a photographer, wildlife biologist, and educator here in the Pacific Northwest. He's the photographer and author of 3 books, Caribou Rainforest, Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, and Wolves in the Land of Salmon. And he's a co-author and photographer of Peterson's Field Guide to North American Bird Nests, and photographer of Big River, Resilience and Renewal in the Columbia Basin, which is out now and he's on tour with. David has contributed his technical experience in the Canadian and U.S. Rocky Mountains, focusing on using tracking to study wildlife ecology and promote conservation. He established the Cascades Wolverine Project, a grassroots effort to support wolverine recovery in the North Cascades here in Washington State, using field science, visual storytelling, and building backcountry community science. David's images have appeared in the New York Times, NBC, Sierra, The National Post, Outside Magazine, Science Magazine, Natural History Magazine, and High Country News. Also, they've appeared for conservation and in conservation campaigns for organizations including National Wildlife Foundation, the Endangered Species Coalition, Wildlands Network, Conservation Northwest, Oregon Wild, WildSite, and Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, to name a few. David holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and outdoor education from Prescott College. He is certified as a track and sign specialist. We get into that in the show. If you're wondering what it is, it's cool. Trailing specialist and a senior tracker through CyberTracker Conservation, and he's an evaluator for CyberTracker for this rigorous international professional certification program. Learn to be a tracker out in the wild. Very cool. We talk about that and many more things in this episode. Really dig into the Columbia River and its relevance to salmon and to all of the people and the landscapes throughout its huge, huge basin. I hope you enjoy this episode with David. It was wonderful to record it, and we'll see you down the trail.
How do you say what you love when the world is burning down? How do you say what you love when pushes come to shove? How do you say what you love when things are upside down? How do you say what you love when times are getting tough?
David Moskowitz, welcome. Where are you coming to us from today?
I'm visiting a friend down in Portland, Oregon. I live in north central Washington State, though.
Cool. I'm going to ask you about that in a little bit, because I've checked out your bio, and I know you're in a place that's very near and dear to a lot of us. But first off, look, this is long format stuff. I love it because we don't have to be really curtailed by a clock or little short sound bites. And what I'd love to do is just open this up and tell us about your story. Where'd you grow up? Who were your influences in your life? And how did you get into this work, this good work that you're doing to save the things you love?
Got it. Well, yeah, my road to my work as a photographer, focusing on conservation stories, and then wildlife conservation work. I moved out to California from the East Coast when I was a teenager and just fell in the Bay Area, fell in love with the outdoors. And right alongside that, quickly realized, like, wow, all these beautiful places and all these amazing species of animals and plants I was learning about, like all the threats that go along with it. So this kind of love of the natural world was kind of born in me right alongside a recognition that that biodiversity is imperiled in our day and age and by humans. And so felt a calling to learn more about the natural world and do what I can to leave the world a slightly, better place, or less bad place, as it were, for future generations.
Was there anything that sparked this in you on the East Coast? And is there anything you miss about the East Coast, or was it sort of a
I moved
love
out.
at first sight?
Yeah, I moved out to California as 13 or 14 years old, and before that, natural spaces were a place to go get the baseball when it rolled off the field and quickly go back to, the ball field or whatever. So it's a totally new world. Learning to backpack in the Sierras, and I lived under Mount Diablo in the East Bay in the Bay Area, and that was kind of my first classroom as a naturalist and outdoor adventurer.
Beautiful. Well, let's jump right into it. You have a magnificent book out now, Big River, Resilience and Renewal in the Columbia Basin. Why is this book so important right now, and why were you drawn to working on it?
Great. Well, I live in the Columbia River watershed, and the book is all about, it's a documentary book about the contemporary Columbia River, and which many indigenous languages refer to the Columbia River as the Big River, is a rough translation of indigenous names. So, so this was a backyard project. I was like, I want to know more about this amazing river whose watershed I live in, and I've done the majority of my work from the age of, I've lived in the watershed for almost my entire adult life, and have worked on projects as a biologist and a photographer and a journalist all over the watershed. So I just was like, I want to know the whole story. And it felt timely for a couple reasons. One is, so the Columbia River is one of the largest watersheds in North America. It's one of the most important, it is the most important watershed in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the most important watersheds in all of North America in terms of hydropower production, salmon, agriculture. And, but there's really there's a lot of stuff published about what was destroyed in the Columbia River with the creation of all the dams. So everything that was lost. There's stuff on the history, like what things were like before the industrialization of the main stem of the river. But there was nothing that really celebrated the diversity and amazing place that the Columbia River watershed is today. And not to take away from the challenges that we face in the watershed, which are huge, but this is still a place that has tremendous biodiversity, tremendous cultural diversity. It's a watershed the size of France, but there's like dozens of indigenous languages spoken within it. There's tons of salmon that still return to various parts of the watershed despite all of the challenges they face. It's a breadbasket for the world. It's produces a huge amount of hydropower. So there's like all of these really important biological and cultural elements of the river today that I really wanted people to see. And I realized that folks outside of the watershed have no idea. This is not like the Colorado River, which is really famous in a sense, like with the Grand Canyon and all that stuff. I really wanted to show people the really beautiful landscapes that are part of this watershed, and then also to paint an image that was a cohesive story that tied together landscapes as disparate as the Columbia ice fields in the Canadian Rockies to the deserts in Nevada and Utah to the Grand Tetons in Wyoming to Astoria, Washington, where it goes into the sea. It's like all of these places are part of one watershed. So I wanted to put that all together and show people what this place really is. And the final thing I'll say is that now is a very important time for us to be thinking about that, because for one, we're renegotiating an international treaty that dictates management of the river. And the old treaty is pretty dated in terms of doesn't really take into account ecological function of the river at all. So there's a chance to update that. And then we're at this turning point culturally where we're recognizing that the ecological services that a healthy watershed provides are just as important and potentially far more valuable than things like agricultural water or hydropower alone, flood control management. And so now is a moment for us to recognize and celebrate the other services that this watershed provides us and advocate for management and care of the river in a way that reflects our better understanding of the 21st century as we look beyond and move away from structures that were created 100 years ago to manage this river.
Well, all my lights are lit up here, so but I'm going to try to stay focused. Let's hover on those ecological benefits. What are you talking about? What are some of those things? What are some examples of those? And are there ways that those can be augmented to really lead us into the next phase of living in place within this watershed?
Sure. I mean, the ecological services of the Columbia River presently and historically are massive, and they range from as widely as fish, which provides a critical protein for people literally all over the world, and was the staple of indigenous peoples here, and continues to be a very important part of their diet. So just providing food, like just without doing anything, you don't have to plow the ground, you don't have to plant seeds. Fish just show up here and feed people. This is an amazing service with the economic value in the millions of dollars. So that's a service that is greatly diminished, but still present, and certainly could be more again in the future. Uh, Water storage. So the watershed, with all of the intact forests, forested landscapes, are natural water storage systems, and the snowpack in our mountains, which is a part of the watershed, is, so much water is stored there, and we don't have to put a dam on the river to store it. We don't have to, do anything. It's just a service that these landscapes provide to us. Like all this snow falls in the winter and then it slowly melts and feeds the lowlands and people. That's a tremendous ecological service provided by the river. Natural flood control. So a healthy watershed and floodplain will allow water to, that's like when big flood events happen, it can spread out and soak into the ground and slow down flood events. And when we destroy floodplains, when we build it, when we make it hardened, then we lose that ecological service that's naturally provided by a healthy river. And then we need to replace that with very expensive flood control structures. So that's an ecological service that's also provided by the river. So that's just a few examples, right. But you can see that they're like the economic value to humans, like the cost, some of those things are just absolutely irreplaceable. Like you can't actually replace them. And their economic value is in the billions of dollars when you add it all up.
Subset of that, keep seeing more and more of, and I'm wondering if you've concentrated on in your photography, is beavers in the West here, right? They're like the ultimate flood control critters, and we're, of course, just taken for an economic boon to, settlers coming out here and almost completely just wiped off the face of the earth. But have you done any work with those guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And beavers are a great example of how the story of the Columbia River is really a complex one. And following a pretty similar narrative to other species, beavers were annihilated or nearly annihilated from much of the Columbia River watershed. And now they're in a state of resurgence, both naturally and because of human help doing that with translocations. And we're recognizing the tremendous ecological value of beavers, which is really another function of a watershed, in that they do all that water storage as well for us. Beavers raise the water table. They slow down and can cool water and recharge watersheds and aquifers. So they're awesome species. Plus, they're really amazing to watch. The work they do is tremendous, very engaging for people. So I definitely spent a lot of time watching beavers and the work of beavers. There's a couple of beaver images in the book, which was fun to pick through what would end up there. But yeah, a really cool critter, and really happy to include them in the project I did.
Nice. Yeah, I love watching those guys, and am constantly amazed what they'll take on. Seeing trees this or bigger that
Right.
are whittled down into the middle, and those guys are industrious, to say the least. Speaking of creating a big work of art like a book, and on my case, making films, it's a collaboration, and this was no different, right? This was a collaboration. Who did you work with on this, and how was that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first person I have to mention is Eileen Delahanty Perks, who wrote the essay, the primary essay that goes with the photos of mine, which is you could describe as like a biography of the river. And Eileen also, she and I, along with the publisher, Braided River, um, really hashed out what was the structure of the book going to be and what were the themes we were going to focus on. So beyond just writing a really beautiful narrative that accompanies the photos in the book, also helped shape my understanding of the river and the themes and how I covered things visually. So she was and her wealth of knowledge on the river is just tremendous. She's published many other books on the Columbia River. So it's just a joy to get to work with her and learn from her. And then dozens and dozens of other collaborators, large and small, a number of like biologists and fisheries folks. A number of the photos in the book, it took a lot of back end research to just find like, who's the person I need to talk to understand the subject, to figure out where to go and when to go. And just to get one image, I did numerous trips that were months in the arranging to go make 2 or 3 photos for the book. And so the acknowledgments in the book kind of tries to lay out all the folks that helped me behind the scenes, and then also in the field. I had a lot of folks help me carrying equipment to crazy places like the top of the Columbia ice field, or wading through rivers to get photos of fish. And huge project, really, really fun, and grateful for all those folks. And a lot of the people that I photographed, I have the whole series of portraits in the book of what I like to think of as river people. And these are people just with unique relationships with the river, whether it's like a rancher out in the desert in the Snake River watershed that depends on water from the watershed to raise cattle, or indigenous fishermen on the lower river that lives right by the river and makes their living fishing. People with all these different relationships with the river, and getting the chance to go out and see them and photograph them and hear their stories in the places that were important to them. So out on the fishing scaffolds of Lou George, or going out and seeing the lock operator on one of the Snake River dams managing the locks that lets barge traffic pass through, and getting to photograph them there and seeing their relationship with the river was just felt really blessed and lucky that people just opened up their vision of the river with me, and then I could in turn pass that on to readers. And similarly, I'd say with wildlife, one of the things that I really believe, humans are just another species on this planet. Humans are just another animal in the watershed. And in the same way that I tried to build relationships and take pictures of people that reflected their experience, their values of the river, I was trying to do that as well with the wildlife, and place them in a context that told their story and how they're related to this watershed.
Beautiful. I know I'm going to just ask for me because I'm curious. I know that a lot of our listeners will be curious as well. But as a fellow storyteller, it's so hard to get your head around the world in how you're telling a story. You mentioned it earlier. How did you go about organizing your thoughts and breaking this up into a cohesive and understandable story? What's your process like?
Yeah, complicated. And I worked at it a few different directions. So some of it was a bit intuitive, like what are the things that feel important? We knew we were going to do a story about the Columbia River. There's going to be salmon involved. We don't know how that's going to fit in or all the different places they'll fit in, but that's a known, right? And then there's some things that's like, well, there's so many millions of different stories to tell. Which are the ones we're going to tell that are examples? Like we can't cover every tributary to the Columbia River, but let's make sure we cover the Owyhee River, which is a great example of a desert watershed. And let's make sure to cover, coastal rainforest river. And so we looked at it from a lot of different lenses. Geographically was one, to make sure we had geographic representation. We looked at it through a cultural lens. So we wanted to make sure that we included examples of as many different cultural perspectives and different cultures that live within the watershed. So there's an indigenous colonial dichotomy.
Mhm.
And but then even within an indigenous perspective, there's 5 major language groups within the watershed, and then dozens of sovereign and nations within that. So we can't include every one of them, but we wanted to make sure that in representing indigenous perspectives and voices that um, we tried to represent, to demonstrate not every voice or perspective out there, but to really highlight the diversity of ways that indigenous people relate to this watershed.
Mhm.
And then within the settler colonial culture, the same thing. We wanted to show all of the different cultural ways that people are relating to the river. So we have folks that are, environmental activists, and folks that are commercial fishermen, and folks that are growing apples or picking apples. It's just, we wanted as many different recreational fishermen, as many different ways that we could look at people's relationship with the river. And then we looked at the important kind of conservation themes of the day. So water management for irrigation and flood control and hydropower, and the biodiversity crisis and climate change. So it's like, how do we weave all of those threads into the story as well?
Mm.
And it was definitely the most complicated story to weave into a single narrative that I've ever worked on. And we actually came up with one structure for the book and laid out the entire book. And Helen Chirullo, who's the publisher at
Mm.
Braided River and an amazing conservationist and visionary for making books, looked at it. We were like 90% of the way there. She's like, nope, doesn't work.
Wow.
And she tore the whole book apart and
Wow.
recreated it in a totally different structure, which I helped with and totally thought was great. So it was epic, and a little bit of magic sprinkled in with a lot of kind of systematic work.
Wow. And then you went and had a good cry, I'm sure.
Exactly. I've got this master spreadsheet that I
Mhm.
created of all of the different images that I thought I wanted, that would track where I'd have to go to get it and what time of year I would get it and the people I'd need to talk to about it. And you could sort it and filter it. And that was like my Bible for 3 years while I was trying to get everything nailed down. So
Wow. Well, I feel you keenly. I'm smack in the phase of trying to wrap up storyline on my film, The Turn, which has a large Snake River portion in it, and I'm locking myself in a room for a week next week in a writer's cabin to get all the
perfect.
threads lined out. And I've been working, same thing. I've been working on it since 21.
Nice.
So I love hearing process stuff. Sorry, folks, if this is boring to you out there. Don't care. Love it. It makes me
Nice.
very happy to hear other people's process. And Helen is amazing. She's a great friend, great
Oh, great.
visionary, great,
Nice.
great visionary leader as well. You're right. I'm sure you had a good understanding of things going into this, or a relative understanding of things compared to your experience, but what are maybe 2 or 3 of the most surprising things you learned during the course of creating this piece of art?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I had enough knowledge to understand the broad brushstrokes of the story, but I definitely learned a ton in the process. The first thing that came to my mind was I'd seen subsistence fishing up in Alaska on rivers with dip nets, and had heard that that was going on the Fraser River, but I didn't realize that there's still indigenous subsistence fishing with traditional methods here on the Columbia River. And that was really eye-opening to me. And getting to go out and like observe and interact with and learn from and about the folks that are still fishing in the same way in the same places that their ancestors have been fishing for thousands of years,
Hmm.
and like amidst the chaos of the 21st century, right? Dams, bridges, superhighways, all this stuff going on all around them. And there they are, carrying on this tradition of fishing and tending to the river, uh, in a way that's been unbroken for millennia. That was really eye-opening. Like I could see that in, more pristine watersheds in Alaska is like, yeah, that's no problem to imagine. But to realize like these folks have managed to maintain that tradition, like in the belly of the beast and, a highly industrialized river system along the main stem of the river and in tributaries and more wild tributaries was really eye-opening and very impressive and very inspiring, honestly.
That's great.
So that was one thing. I learned a ton about water management and dam management and like why there's water in one. But sometimes you'll go along the Columbia River, which is much of it is now flat water from dams that are backed up one against the other. And it's like, why does this one have low water and the next one have high water? And like, how does that all work? And so I learned a lot about water management and how that happens is another thing. Those are two things that stand out, off the cuff.
Great answers. And do you go into that in the book, especially on the water management side of things?
Yeah, Eileen definitely touches on the complexities of managing the river and the different um, values and that drive that. And so, yeah, we do touch on that. I mean, not in the amount of detail I got fascinated about, right? Because it's like, it's not the layperson needs to know the broad brushstrokes,
Sure.
but I did a bit more of a deep dive into that for sure.
Did you, I know I do this. Did you, I'm sure there was moments where you would look out over the landscape and maybe kind of do a mental overlay of what you thought it might be like pre-European contact. Did did that hit you at various times, and what was that feeling like if it did?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One of the formative books in my coming of age as a conservationist was Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's in there that he said becoming ecologically literate is to wake up in a world full of wounds,
Mm,
and that's been
beautiful.
a theme of my understanding of the world is realizing like, wow, this even landscapes we think of as quote unquote wild and pristine are deeply impacted by settler colonialism on
Mm,
many levels. And actually, the Columbia River watershed is kind of an interesting mix where we do have landscapes that still reflect what they looked like pre-European settlement. So
mhm,
grasslands where there's no invasive species and primeval forests that have been growing since the end of the ice age and mountaintops that still look like the ice age is going on. So you can blend that with driving along the main stem of the Columbia in Oregon and Washington and realizing like it's not even a river, it's a series of flat water reservoirs. And like, what did it look like underneath? It's like, I can't even imagine.
mm,
And what did that floodplain look like when the river could rise and drop of its own accord and braided channels and and all of that? So it was definitely there's some places where I could see it. You could go drive through a potato field and I've seen what those grasslands look like because there are patches of it. And I could, overlay that. And then there's other places where it's like um, what was once is just lost to me in terms of my imagination. Um, and I'd also say I was curious about that and wanted to make sure to show to visualize in the book some of those pristine landscapes, but I was less interested in cataloging things that were lost
mhm,
or artifacts of the past and more interested in showing people what is today.
mm,
And so I was really working on landscapes that integrated geography and wildlands with human structure, bridges and dams all set in a big context that shows the river as it currently exists today. And like, irrigated landscapes with mountains beyond them and like just that helps people appreciate what is today, which is a place of, really intense wounds, but also magnificent beauty and like very important cultural value to the people who live here. So I really tried to take a sober, clear-eyed, but like, appreciative view of the beauty, including the scars of this landscape as we experience it today.
Well said. Big River, Resilience and Renewal in the Columbia Basin. David, I don't have the book. I'm getting it, and I cannot wait to dig into this. This is just a luminous feat that you have put together. Where can folks get it if they want to purchase the book?
Anywhere books are sold, we do have a website that you can get a sneak peek at some of the photos and get a sense of the book and see our collaborators, and then find out about events and then also buy it. And that's bigrivercolumbia.org.
Perfect.
Yep.
We're going to link all that stuff up in the show notes, but we also have more to dig into. Halftime. Did you know you could have the world's finest wild salmon shipped directly to your door? It's true. Our Ava's Wild Bristol Bay sockeye salmon is the lowest carbon footprint center plate protein on the planet, and it's packed with heart-healthy omega-3 fatty acids. Don't take our word for it. Ask chefs like Seattle's Tom Douglas and Taichi Kitamura, who are serving our sashimi-grade wild salmon in their award-winning restaurants. You can have the exact same fillets we deliver to them, shipped flash frozen to your door. What's more, Ava's Wild donates 10% of our profits to Indigenous-led efforts to protect Bristol Bay in perpetuity. That's the place we source the salmon from. Right now, that looks like supporting the Bristol Bay Foundation, granting Bristol Bay's Indigenous young people scholarships to four-year colleges, universities, and trade schools. Visit avaswild.com to join our growing community doing good by eating right. That's save, spelled backwards, wild.com, and eat wild to save wild. Now, back to the show. I'm curious, I know you're working in Portland today, but I understand that you live in the traditional homelands of the Medow people. Where would you say the root of your heart is geographically? Is it there, or I should say maybe even geologically? Is it there, or is there another place that calls to you even deeper?
Yeah, I think the North Cascades are the place I call home, and I often ask folks I'm working with, yeah, what do you think of as home? However you define it, it could be where you lay your head or where your soul will go when your body stops working on this planet. But yeah, I think the North Cascades. And so living on the east slope of the North Cascades I feel really lucky to get to live in such a beautiful part of the world. And wherever I travel for work, which is far and wide, I'm always happy to come home.
Nice. Do you do things? I would imagine living there, function of that is getting out and being in the system itself, in the relationship with the land. What are some of the things that draw you to that part of the world?
Yeah, well, on a personal level, I'm a trail runner and a mountain climber and a rock climber and a skier and a hiker and backpacker and naturalist. So yeah, all mountain biker, all of the above.
Heaven.
I'll do it. And then, but I have work both far from home, but then also I have a number of projects that are close to home as well, which is great. I've been working on a combination research and photography conservation project on wolverines
Oh, yes.
in the Cascades. And so that's a backyard project for me, which I'm really grateful for. I've been working on that with Steph Williams as my primary collaborator for 6 or 7 years now. And a few other smaller things as well, close to home.
Cool. Well, to quote Rumi, what great big foolish project do you have in your future? Is there something that your heart is drawn to right now that is you're working on, or is there something maybe a little bit further off in the horizon? Is there something that's really calling to you to tackle as a subject or as a means of artistic expression?
That's a good question. I mean, right now I'm in the midst of we did all this work on the Big River project. So I'm doing the less exciting part of actually doing, talks like this and, speaking events and making sure that we put all those photos to work. So that's an important part of my work, not just taking the photos, but making sure they're helping with conservation.
That's right.
So I'm doing that, and I'm on a little bit of a hiatus between big projects, which I'm excited about. So I'll be doing a little fishing for what's next. But in the interim, the one thing that I have picked up again is I'm working on my own personal project on a series of images of the proprietors of taco trucks.
Sick, dude.
Yeah, you can
Beautiful.
find taco trucks all over the place, and I love eating tacos and street food, Mexican
Oh
street
man.
food. And so I'm hoping to put together a portfolio of images of the different people that um, make tacos and taco trucks, and share a little bit of why they have a taco truck and why it
Oh,
is what it is.
sign me up. I'm getting that immediately. I am a
Exactly.
taco truck sucker for
There you
sure.
go.
Yeah. Well,
Usually when I tell people that, they're like, what? That's not
I
like
think it's rad. Good,
change
good work. That's beautiful. Nothing
of
better than,
pace.
man, nothing better than a real salty taco truck. My friend Amy Gulick would slap me if she heard me asking you what's next. She's like, we're right here. We're in the middle of this. We're doing a book.
I can
But
see Amy saying that.
yes, but I always wonder, I've got things that I think about, like you got to concentrate what's in front of you. Um, I'm gonna go with the taco trucks. I think that's
Great.
wonderful. Uh, so tell me, and I think specifically here for our listeners, what is a track and sign specialist? Is it hard to become one?
Great. That's a great question. Um, so track and sign specialist is a certification that's awarded to somebody through Cyber Tracker Conservation International, which, as far as I know, is the only international body that provides professional certification in wildlife tracking. Um, and specialist is the highest level of certification you can be awarded. Now, the certification process actually has two parts: track and sign and trailing.
Mm,
And track and sign interpretation, to get certified in that, you go through a rigorous field examination where you're provided a series of tracks and signs to interpret. And then trailing, the other half of that, you actually have to pick a trail of an animal and follow it until you find the animal, and try not to just disturb it in the process. And that's the test for that. So it
mm.
is very rigorous. Wildlife tracking isn't a skill that anybody is born with, but we all are born with the capacity to learn it. It's a cross-cultural, traditional ecological knowledge that people have developed independently all over the planet wherever they interacted with wildlife. And it has many different contemporary applications in the modern world.
Such as?
Hunting,
Mhm.
wildlife research, wildlife
Mm,
conservation,
mm,
education. So, nature education and
right.
personal enrichment, search and rescue. I mean, dozens of different, it's like people use it in all sorts of large and small ways. And then I think you're referring to, so another hat I wear when I'm not working as a photographer is I am a evaluator for Cyber Tracker Conservation,
Mm.
and provide training and assessment, and then certificates to folks who qualify in wildlife tracking, with the vision for that project to create a standard and an appreciation for that skill set, and encourage its use in conservation and education and research in the modern world.
Well, when I pull the throttle back a little bit here and finish this film, I'm going to be calling you. It's
Great.
Oh yeah, fascinating. I've always wanted to learn that, and it's not something that, for me as a person who struggles with just book learning alone, I need to get with somebody who is out in the field, understand it in that way. That's a very
Yeah. Well,
technical.
wildlife tracking is one of my original mentors in wildlife tracking was a man named Charles Worsham, and he was an art history professor and an amazing artist, visual artist. And he really described wildlife tracking as a visual language, and interpreting tracks and understanding tracks was a process of reading the landscape and reading signs and disturbances uh, in the same way we read a book, but rather than letters and numbers and all that stuff, it's like the tracks and the signs are the story, are telling the story. And as a photographer, um, that's often looking at landscapes and trying to figure out what are the elements that will visually tell the story that I'm trying to get across. It's a natural overlay to wildlife tracks and signs where in some ways the animals have done the same thing, right? Where they have left messages on the landscape that if you look at it and think about will communicate a story to you. And so my work as a photographer and as a wildlife tracker go hand in hand, not just because I use tracks to find wildlife, but also because it's drawing on a similar way of seeing and interacting with the world.
Beautiful. Totally get that. And I think the visual aspect is the large part of it for me as well. And I think to feel that kinship, to have an understanding, not just a cursory glance, but a, hey, that's a deer, that's a porcupine, that's a fox. It feels like you're not alone. It feels like you are connected in a way that is real and less about guessing and more about an invitation to be a part of that bigger natural world. It's great. So I know another aspect of work that you do is around citizen science and monitoring. And what is that? And why is it so important and how does it work?
Great. Yeah, well, community science is a form of research and monitoring that involves employing members of the community in which you're doing research. So in my case, it's often folks that recreate in natural spaces, helping collect data on usually wildlife that also uses those same natural spaces where they recreate. And um, that ties in really well to wildlife tracking too, because it's a simple way to collect data that everybody can do, and you don't need expensive equipment to do it and so forth. I really appreciate community science as a method for monitoring and collecting information um, because it's very engaging. It has not just the conservation benefit of learning about the species you're studying, but also of engaging the community of people that will become stewards, are part of the stewardship of that landscape, or could become advocates for the species that you're studying, or might be negatively affected by conservation measures that would be taken. And I want those folks to understand what's at stake for the wildlife and for themselves. And so there's a level of engagement there that I think is important. You probably have, it's not lost on you and most of our, listeners that our society also has an increasing skepticism for experts, which is a challenge in the complicated world that we live in now, where we do need specialized expertise to understand things. But at the same time, I believe there is a natural skepticism of things we don't understand, which is healthy and valuable and has benefited us as a species. And so one of the things I love about community science is that it puts the power of data collection and sometimes the power of interpreting that data in the people rather than in experts that are separated from that. And so there's a democratization of research and science that goes along with that, where a community can be like, we collected this data, so therefore we understand how it's collected and what it means. And then these interpretations of that actually align with what I saw in collecting this data, or it doesn't align with that, and I need to ask more questions. But there's a engagement in the research that is different when you've got skin in the game of actually collecting, as opposed to being like, oh, I don't understand what that means, or I bet they made that up, or there's like this othering of experts in science that you can't do when you're like, well, who collected this information? It's like, well, you did, or your neighbor did,
Do you have a sense? It feels great. I love it. And do you have a real sense of community around that? I mean, are there actual physical gatherings where people share data, or is it more of a sort of an online community where there's a data set that's available?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the project. And
Mhm.
so, I do some work as basically as a consultant to help manage or set up, different projects, and really will tailor it to the needs, the goals of whatever that project is. So I've been working with Conservation Northwest for, gosh, a decade and a half on a community science project in the Cascades and along Snoqualmie Pass. And that often involves small groups of people getting together, going out, collecting the data, and then it gets uploaded to a shared database. So there is a like literal
Mhm.
physical community aspect of that. But then with the Wolverine Project, for instance, we just have an online portal. And if you are recreating or doing whatever you're doing in the Pacific Northwest and you encounter what you believe to be Wolverine tracks or an actual Wolverine, you can make that report through our online portal, and then that all
Cool.
gets collected and summarized and shared. So nobody, it's like we sometimes I know the people that are sending data, and we do have repeat offenders that will send us, that are really into it, which is awesome. And sometimes it's just somebody who thinks they saw Wolverine, finds our website because we advertise that we're looking for Wolverine information, and this is what a Wolverine looks like, and this is what their tracks look like. So then they'll submit their observation to us, and yeah,
That's great. That's great. I
yeah,
just yesterday saw, I think it was the Park Service posted photographs of wolverines on the sides of Mount Rainier.
yeah,
Yeah. Wow. That was stunning.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. Are there folks then who collate and adjudicate the information? Obviously it's a democratized way of gathering the information, but then are there, you know, qualified biologists or others who are sort of
Yeah, so that's
curating?
a great question. And so that is one of the critiques of community science often is like, well, garbage data in, garbage,
Hmm.
results out.
Hmm.
And um, so we will both train our volunteers to, do a good job in data collection. And the argument that professional scientists are better data collectors than members of the public sometimes is true and sometimes is abjectly false. There's some amazing naturalists there, and especially when you get to specialized knowledge, like I've met a lot of amateur birders that, I cower in their presence as far as like identifying birds and so forth. So it's like I think that's a spurious assumption just to make in general.
Hmm.
But that being said, with projects where we're just asking people, it's like, if you think this could be a Wolverine, send us the information. Then obviously we need folks that can be like, yes, this is a Wolverine, or
Yep.
no, it's not a Wolverine, or there's not enough information to say one way or the other. So we do use expert reviewers, and I'm often one of those expert reviewers, and then we've got a couple different members of the public that are experts, have that expertise that share that. And then we're just now, well, depending on the project, there's different ways that we'll share that data back out and make it available for peer review in one way or the other. So there's transparency in our methods there.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And this is all. You have a great website. It's linked up here, and we're going to put that in our show notes as well. But if folks, if you want to get involved in some of this citizen science and public science, by all means, it is a worthy endeavor. I know you bring a lot of human element to the work as well, and the talks that you give. And what are some of your funniest encounters in the wild with landscapes, animals, people, and anything that comes to mind that might might have been unexpected? Sometimes it comes through misery, sometimes it comes through happenstance. But are there any things that stick out to you either through the creation of the current book or the work that you've done in the past?
Um, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind was one of my previous book projects, which was also with Braided River, called Caribou Rainforest, which is
Hmm.
all about a very unique ecosystem in the inland Pacific Northwest, the only intact interior temperate rainforest on the planet, and mountain caribou, which are an endemic species of or subspecies of caribou that rely on that habitat. For that project, I got really good at figuring out how to track down these elusive mountain caribou. And about 2 years into the project, I had an epiphany that I could look at a map and pick the spot where I thought mosquitoes would be the worst. And that is where I would probably need to go to find mountain caribou. And it was this total, like, as a recreationalist, I'd actually gotten pretty good at being like, oh yeah, I don't think I want to go do this climbing trip in July because the mosquitoes are going to be horrible. So I'll put that off till August, So it's like this reversal where all of a sudden it was like I'm like literally seeking out places where I'm going to be miserable in the mosquitoes because I want to find mountain caribou.
Oh,
And I
God.
promised myself that my next project would be looking at some sort of species on a beach in the tropics, but that hadn't happened. So
That hasn't happened yet. Oh, man.
kind of a glutton
Let's
for
see.
punishment.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's see. This is my misery map here. Where can I?
Exactly.
Oh man, yeah, I've experienced that up in Bristol Bay, and it's sometimes it's you can't even explain it. It's just like a dull whine across the entire tundra, and it's just like smoke. It's unreal.
Yeah, and I think it also is kind of as a storyteller, photographer, the moment you feel like you want to put your camera away because conditions are so miserable, that's probably the most important time to have it out. Like I'm photographing an expedition and it's getting dark and it started to snow and it's freezing cold. Those are the images that are going to tell the story the best. And so I do feel like as a photographer, it is like this, like, race towards the most kind of miserable conditions to get the most compelling photographs. And you have to really appreciate type 2 fun. It's not fun while
It's
you're having it, but it is fun to think about afterwards to lean into a career doing the types of photography that and I think it's true with research as well. A lot of times you end up doing things to collect data that just no sane human would do for recreation alone.
I've had that feeling so many times. I guess one that comes to mind most recently was on up the Selway River, and it was getting dark, and started putting things away, and was by myself and starting to head back down the road, and was like, wait a minute, and stopped, just kind of not didn't see anything, but just on a feeling, and then just had this absolutely beautiful shaft of light come straight up the canyon and shot it, on the
Nice.
drone. And it was like, okay, that was good. Listen,
Perfect.
listen,
Yeah.
your gut. And yeah, there is a misery factor there for sure. I think you intonated earlier about sort of the skepticism around experts, using air quotes. And there's no doubt, like, we are in a time, at least in my life of half a century, that there's never been a greater divide around our citizens in America. And do you feel like nature and truly immersing ourselves in nature through the experiences you've done and as a naturalist and as a hobbyist, is there a common language there that can help heal these wounds and bridge these divides that are inherent among everyday citizens in this country?
I mean, certainly shared collective experience helps create a sense of camaraderie and understanding. So I think that's something that's been helpful for me, is engaging in activities with people with wildly different, cultural backgrounds and perspectives on the world. Might not lead me to like agree with them, but it leads me to understand them and why they advocate for the things that they do. And I think that is a critical function of shared collective experience, and is that we, especially in such a diverse society, have the capacity to both appreciate our perspective and the reason we think X is right and Y is wrong, but at the same time to not just be like, well, anybody that thinks different is bad or incorrect, but to be like, wow, a different cultural lens will yield a different idea about what's right and what's wrong. And I think that humility is a critical part of creating solutions that works for all or as many people as possible when we have such a diversity of experiences. And that also, I think, rolls over into um, care for other species on this planet, which is we might need a stretch of river to make hydropower because we need hydropower to, you know, run the industries that provide sustenance for our people, which is reasonable. Like every species needs to make a living. But that same stretch of river is also an important piece of real estate for salmon or for beavers or for other species, and they use it in a different way. And it's not less valuable for fish than it is for us, right? It's like an appreciation that like, oh, this is how fish see this resource, and this is why they need it to look a certain way. And from that, we can start figuring out like, is there a way for humans to make a living on this stretch of river and for salmon to make a living on this stretch of river in the same way that it'd be like, wow, orchardists have a tradition of agriculture and they produce food for themselves and others, and that's valuable. And we, as somebody that's a conservationist from another place, sees the value in that water being used in a different way. And that is also important. And like, how do we find ways to bridge gaps that are based on different perspectives and different value systems that can accommodate a wide variety of perspectives and needs, whether it's across species or within, different culture groups within humans.
I sense the humility in you and in your work, and just glancing through your, for instance, clear cutting the Caribou Rainforest. My guess is that's not a prescription you would offer for interaction and relationship with the land. But when you look at these photographs of yours, there is a very real humanity and a humility, I think, by gaining the trust in these folks, these loggers, um, and photographing them in a very human and dignified way. And I, I for one believe that's a way forward. So I thank you for
Yeah,
that work.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've come toward the end of our show here for today, and thank you. It's been just wonderful getting to know you a little bit. Your work is astonishing, and we're going to again link up all of the links to find David's work here in our show notes. But we have a bonus round here. Nobody escapes it, and it's just a fun little thought exercise. Being in the world of climate change that we are, I just want you to imagine for a moment that it's not going to happen, knock on wood, but say there was a fire coming toward your house, which, is not impossible these days.
Now where I live, yeah, it's
You,
certainly possible.
exactly. And you get clearly you get out your loved ones and your critters. They're safe. But if there's only one physical thing you could take, what would that be?
Uh, I mean, we've got a list of things in our house that are supposed to go, like the one backpack of stuff. So
Of
this is
course you
not
do.
this is
Yes.
not a theoretical subject. I've lost
Right.
stuff in wildfires in the Methow. Um, but if I'd say, yeah, I mean, I think it's like we've got a lockbox. It's a very like not very exciting answer, but we've got a fire safe that includes documents and hard drives of some photos and a few critical things. And I think I would just take that and walk away. And as I it's an exercise. Thinking about that is an exercise in non-attachment and
Exactly.
recognizing that you build a lot of things in your life and collect a lot of things, but at the end you can't take it with you. So how do you live with that in mind?
That's kind of the point. Yep, for sure. Well,
Yeah.
one last one. If it's not a physical thing, if you could only take one trait about you that makes you and most alive and most luminous in your life, what would be that trait that you would take?
Persistence.
Mm,
Yeah, I always say that I don't have a whole lot of skill in things, but I'm willing to do it for long enough to get the results that I want.
I very much identify with that exact
Yeah,
sentiment. So thank you for sharing that. All
you got
right.
it.
Well, David, how can folks find and support you in this beautiful work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, through my website, davidmoskowitz.net is a great way, or on Instagram, Moskowitz_David. And I do have a Patreon site where if you want to back my work, all of that money goes to helping me donate work to conservation organizations that can't afford to pay for it. And yeah, would be grateful for support through that for sure.
Beautiful. And again, linked up in the show notes. David Moskowitz, thank you for joining us here on Save What You Love, and we'll see you down the trail.
Sounds great. Good to chat.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love? How do you say what you love?
Thank you for listening to Save What You Love. If you like what you're hearing, you can help keep these conversations coming your way by giving us a rating on whatever platform you're listening from and leaving a comment on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Check out photos on our Instagram feed. We're at Save What You Love Podcast, and you can get links from today's featured guest in the show notes of this episode. Join our growing community by subscribing to our newsletter at avaswild.com and then clicking on Connect in the upper corner. You'll get exclusive offers on wild salmon shipped to your door and notifications about upcoming guests and more great content on the way. That's at avaswild.com, the word save spelled backwards, wild.com. This episode was produced by Emily Fern and edited by Patrick Troll. Original music was created by Whiskey Class. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you all down the trail.